Hey guys, welcome back to the Second Time Lucky Mining channel. In today's video, we are going to talk about Flux proof of useful work. Now, if you like the Flux content, please like the video and maybe even consider subscribing to the channel. That'll help me out a great deal. But enough of me shilling my channel, let's jump into the content. Now, if you haven't caught up on the news on the weekend, the Flux team performed a AMA or Ask Me Anything, and they focused on proof of useful work. Now, I'm super excited about proof of useful work, but in today's video, what we're going to have a look at is some of the documentation that the Flux team put out, what is the use cases that they are targeting, what are the potential hardware requirements, and then what are my thoughts and what am I going to do looking forward over the next at least year and potentially next year. What am I going to go and have a look at? Now, as usual, a couple of disclaimers when I talk about Flux. I am very heavily invested in the Flux ecosystem. I have been a GPU miner of Flux. I run a node on Flux. I have an app running on Flux. You see all these clothes, but I am not sponsored at all by the Flux team or even part necessarily of the Flux development team. I'm just an average miner enjoying or excited about what Flux has to offer. Yes, every project is not perfect, so there's a lot of things that I don't like necessarily about the Flux ecosystem, but I try and look at also the positives, and at least in my opinion, the positives outweigh the negatives. Now that the disclaimers are out of the way, let's jump on the computer and have a look at the documentation, and I'll share my opinion on it.
Okay, so here we are on the computer. Now, I've managed to get the presentation that was presented in the Flux AMA. It was shared in the Flux Discord in the Proof of Useful Work discussion section here, and I would encourage you guys to go and check that out and answer or ask any questions that you might have. Now, what we are going to go through is typically what the Flux team went through, and I'll skip to the meat and potatoes of it, but we'll have a look at some of the use cases that they're targeting, the hardware, some of the operating model that they've got, some of the specifications, and then I'll share sort of my thoughts and what I am going to do in the future. Now, if you wanted to skip to a specific section, please use the timestamps below as it will take you directly to the section. Now, let's jump into the use cases or defining proof of useful work. So they've got the mission statement here. I'm not going to bore you specifically with that, but looking at the use cases, they are targeting specific use cases here: machine learning, AI applications, rendering, and cloud gaming/streaming. Now, ChatGPT has brought machine learning/AI to the mainstream, but it's actually been used for longer than that. Now, depending on where you work and what you do in your day job, you might not have seen that, but I can at least attest firsthand experience to at least machine learning in the workplace. Now, what is the practical application of that? And I'll share at least my real world example. So for those of you that don't know, I used to work at a fairly large beer company, and there was a couple of the KPIs and stats that we used to track to sort of see how successful we are in the marketplace. And one of those metrics that we used to track is something that we call share of shelf. So it's basically what is the percentage of the shelf space is your product out there. So that sort of leads into the shoppable market specifically for your product. Again, I don't want to bore you with the definition of the KPI, but one of the metrics, that was one of the key metrics that we used to track, and our sales representative used to go out and count or calculate roughly what is our share of shelf within a specific retailer or marketplace. What we then started using is machine learning. So we started taking photos of shelves, and machine learning at the back end would calculate automatically what is our share of that shelf and calculate that KPI with lots of different photos coming in. It would automatically do that. How that was done is specifically machine learning. So we had to train the software to recognize our brands, our logos, all of those type of things, and it will then automatically categorize the products. Again, that's a practical example of machine learning. Now, it's used way more than you think. Yes, I know ChatGPT is now mainstream, but it's used, or at least machine learning is used in a lot of industries to track a lot of things. So I do really like that they're going after that market. And again, if I take my practical application of it, we had to send through thousands and thousands and thousands of images and training this actual software to recognize our brands. So there's a lot of learning. I remember it taking at least a month to train the software. So that type of things is what GPU horsepower potentially could accelerate specifically for us. And again, I really like this specific use case. Rendering, again, obviously I have YouTube videos, so I'm pretty used to the rendering component of it. So I like that they've got that there. Again, the actual use case for that should be fairly simple. You should be able to get a project and render it out. Cloud gaming, and this is where I've got my little bit of reservations. At least in my opinion, cloud gaming hasn't really kicked off. There's lots of different reasons for it, and we've seen different competitors try and gun specifically for this market. The most recent one, and then the failure, is somebody like Google with Google Stadia. And at least, Google's got a reputation of starting stuff and stopping it, but I don't see there be a massive market for that. The fact that consoles is already out there, it's fairly affordable. Yes, it can be expensive for a lot of people, but it's fairly affordable. The other competitor to that is obviously the PlayStation and Xbox alternatives to this cloud gaming. On top of that, GeForce Now is a thing, and at least here where I stay, they've been pushing hard to get people to use GeForce Now, and the cost is actually not that expensive. I think I saw a promotion the other day of about $3.50. And when GeForce Now actually launched here in Australia, I actually tested it out, and I just didn't like the latency. And that for me is the big detractor for that. But again, I might not be the target market, and the games that I play might not be within the realm of proof of useful work. So maybe I'm a little bit biased. It's just not for me. I've got a massive gaming computer, so there's no real need for me to cloud game. But other than that, I do think that the use cases is fantastic, and I love to see, these things in the future will just become more and more. So I'm really excited that the Flux team is actually going after this specific market. Now, scrolling a little bit down, looking at the configuration here. Now, what you will see here and what they illustrated, and hopefully I'll show it to you in shortly, but they'll have a benchmark where you'll actually benchmark your system, and it will tag and it will benchmark you across a wide variety of different things. So as I mentioned, there's a couple of use cases, and not all the use cases are the same. So depending on your system configuration that you've got, that you have set up specifically for proof of useful work, your setup might be good at something and maybe not very good at something else. So based on that, you can tag sort of what you wanted to do and what you would be good at. And again, what also they hinted at is the ability for you to switch certain things on. So certain tasks might take a long time, some tasks might be short. So you'll have the option to nitpick and decide what do you actually want to do. And again, as a user of that ecosystem, and again as a miner, it's actually going to be, or at least what I see, I haven't seen these things practically, but what it looks like is it's customizable around what actually do you want to do with your proof of useful rig, and what will it particularly be good at. So you'll be able to assess what your machine is good at based on the benchmarks, and depending on your situation and your unique requirements, you'll be able to say, I want to do these tasks and not those. So that I think is quite cool. Okay, so let me scroll further down on the hardware. It talks about configuration. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. It talks about the operating model here. There'll be a scheduler, secure delivery, and potentially this is one of my concerns, but I'll get to my concerns sort of at the end here. Load balancing, validate, and distribute work. So this is sort of the OS component of the Flux OS proof of useful work operating system is what I'm calling it. It's a lot of words, but if I scroll a little bit down, it talks about the dashboard. And again, we'll show you the dashboard shortly. Keep on going down. Operating model, I'm not really interested in that. Hardware specifications here. So this is a important piece here around the virtualization. Now, it's something that I had to do. I remember on my current gaming CPU is virtualization wasn't switched on by default in the BIOS. Even though it can do it, the default setting in the BIOS was actually turned off. So it's important that your hardware actually supports virtualization. So now most modern hardware actually does. So I don't think it's a big thing. It's just people that haven't gone into the BIOS and updated that setting. You might need to flash your BIOS, but it shouldn't be too much of an issue specifically for GPU miners. I guess we're used to fiddling around in the BIOS and changing settings. Now, continuing going down on the hardware specifications here. Now, this is what I found interesting, the hardware recommendations here. Now, on the motherboard here, they specified that for those of you that's not aware, and a lot of GPU miners might actually not be aware, we've been spoiled with GPU mining in the past, or at least what it is in its current form, where we can get away with, doesn't really matter the PCIe gen, and the amount of lanes. As long as you've got one lane, we were able to mine and mine efficiently. There wasn't really any incentive or extra mega hashes or whatever you want to call it if you had a faster generation or more lanes dedicated to your GPU when mining. However, with proof of useful work, this is going to be completely different here. And as you can see here, this is the first recommendation that the Flux team has set out. So ideally, you need to be PCIe Gen 3 and above. So what the current latest hardware is supported is actually Gen 5. My specific system is only Gen 4, and it's got some combinations of Gen 3. So you'll need to have a look at what your motherboard and CPU actually supports in terms of the gen. But if you've at least bought a GPU, a motherboard at least in the last 2 years, a new one, or 3 years, you at least would have Gen 3. Now, the other thing here is the amount of lanes. Now, a typical GPU in a gaming rig, there would be 1 times 16 slot where you would put your GPU in. In here, they would recommend, at least for proof of useful work, to have at least 8 lanes. So this is where the motherboard and CPU combinations is going to be very, very interesting. And you know what would transpire here, and at least my opinion is, normal consumer grade hardware is not really designed specifically to maximize your output in something like AI or proof of useful work. So the amount of lanes that you get from consumer grade hardware is not going to be the same as what you would see in an enterprise or server grade hardware. So there will be limitations in terms of what you can do with your typical mining rig and also your typical gaming rig. And at least in my opinion, I do think that more enterprise or server grade hardware would support more lanes, and hence you would have a better chance, getting a more or better benchmarks for proof of useful work. Now, the other thing here that was interesting is they had a per CPU or per thread count per GPU. So they've got here 4. Now, what that would mean is if you've got a typical proof of useful rig of 4, you would need at least 16 threads. So 4 threads per GPU if you only had 4 GPUs. So that would be an 8-core CPU, something like, I don't know, a 5800X or a 7700X. So those are CPUs that's got 16 cores. Now, if you've got more GPUs, then obviously you'd need more threads, and that's where the higher core count CPUs actually comes in. Now, the other thing that I found super interesting, and it's something that I actually didn't thought about up until the AMA, is the actual RAM requirement. I am aware, and if you haven't seen normal professional graphics card, they have a lot of memory. And the reason for that, a lot of these models are saved within the memory and then feed the GPU back and forth. So it's important to have a lot of memory on your GPU, specifically for professional tasks. And that's really a thing in terms of proof of useful work. But what I didn't count on is the actual RAM requirements, specifically on the CPU here. Now you can see the Flux team's recommendation is to at least have a match with your system RAM with your GPU RAM. The shorthand for that is VRAM. So what does that mean? So if I take up a calculator here, so let's say I've got, I don't know, an 8 gigabyte GPU, let's say a 3070, it's got 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Now what I would at least need, let's say my rig has got 4 gigs, 4 graphics cards of 4 3070s, I would at least need 32 gigs of RAM within my proof of useful work rig. Now, If you've seen the typical mining rig, they've got 8 gigs. RAM hasn't really been a big thing in our mining rig. So what we'll have to do going forward at the minimum is at least match our VRAM capacity here with our system RAM here. Now, if you've got GPUs that uses more RAM, so let's say a A4000, and that's the GPU that I suspect might be very good in proof of useful work. So it's got 16 gigs of RAM. Let's say I've got 4 of them. I need at least 64 gigs of RAM. Now, if you look at the Flux recommendation here, they say, you should have at least 25% more RAM than VRAM. So what that means is if I multiply this by 1.25 to add another 25% on that, that's 80 gigs of RAM for a 4000 GPU. So again, and what they really recommend here at the bottom, so think of it as minimum, ideal, and what you should be is 4 times. Now, again, if I do the math, so if I take 64 gigs, again, that's for a 4000 GPUs, and I times it by 4 times, that's a quarter a terabyte of RAM on the system. So what you can see here, looking at these specifications, in a nutshell, what it means is you'll need to look at your PCIe gens and make sure that you at least have 8 lanes per GPU. And again, if I take 4 GPUs as a base, as an example, so 8 times 4, you need to at least have 32 lanes for those GPUs available. And again, a lot of consumer grade hardware doesn't have that support. So again, that's where server grade and professional hardware comes in. Now, CPU here, at least if it's virtualized and you need at least 4 cores, for me, this is probably the easiest requirement to meet. The next things in relation to RAM is more difficult. So you at least need to have, or the GPUs that will do well is the GPUs that tend to have more VRAM. And then on top of that, your system RAM needs to at least match it or be 25% more normal RAM compared to VRAM, or 4 times more RAM than VRAM. So it's important to look at these hardware recommendations when you are going to procure hardware for proof of useful work. Now, the last thing in terms of hardware specifications here is the storage. So they recommend having a boot drive being an NVMe, and then a hard drive for storing large amount of data. Personally, what I would do is, yes, I'll definitely have an NVMe for my boot drive, but I probably would store on a SATA SSD and not a hard drive. Again, that's just me. I don't like hard drives that much, but again, that's just a personal thing on my side. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the screenshots here. So this is the team. And if I scroll a little bit further down, here you can see the Logon screen. Now, I really like this Logon screen, and what I do like about the Logon is the ability to log on via email. And if you're not familiar with the Flux ecosystem, or at least some of the other OSs and drives that they have, everything is tied to Zelcore, and I don't like being tied to a centralized wallet. And what I mean by centralized wallet, it's sort of like a closed wallet, and the ability to have or log in via email is opening it up to lots of different people. So in the past, you needed to have the Zelcore wallet to log in and register and deploy applications and stuff like that. And here, at least, in order to be a miner, you are not necessarily tied to the Zelcore wallet. Here, you can at least log in with a username and password. I suspect that if you're getting paid out in Flux, you obviously still need a Zelcore wallet, but at least the platform, you can log in via a username and password, which is more mainstream, to be honest. Now, looking at the actual dashboard here, my first impression is it really looks good. I like how clean it is and how functional it is. The ability here, as you can see in the dashboard, there is 3 workers. So it almost got the HiveOS feel, but a Flux flavor. So you can see it's nice white and blue. It also has the ability to add more workers, and a worker could have GPUs assigned to it here. So there's a couple of controls here. I would imagine that is restart, stop, and play. I'm not exactly sure what the system utilities are if you needed to check the benchmarks, but what you can see here and what I liked is your estimated profitability, your benchmark score. Now, what I'm not sure about is from what I understand, there'll be multiple different things in terms of benchmarks. So your GPU might be benchmarked, let's say, for machine learning versus rendering versus gaming, right? So those are three distinct workloads and would have three different benchmarks. So again, if I take the A4000 route, it would potentially be good in the professional things, so like rendering and AI, but might not be the best gaming GPU, right? And there's videos online where, especially in the GPU crisis, where people were trying to use the A4000 compared to a 3070, and it just was a little bit worse compared to a 3070. But anyway, so I'm not sure if this is a average across multiple benchmarks, but looking at some of the other things here and some of the things that will become important here is uptime and reliability. Now, something that was asked and the Flux team sort of alluded to is your reliability score. So, some jobs might take a very long time to render. So, having your rig up will ensure that not only do you complete the task for a paying customer, and this is the key thing that I think miners probably would need to change their mindset. There'll be a paying customer on the other side of proof of useful work. What that means is somebody is paying real money to get their project delivered, either uh, AI machine learning, or they need something rendered. So if your machine is crashing or stops halfway, or you have a power cut, that is not that person's problem, right? He is paid the correct amount. I'm not sure what the correct amount is going to be, but he's paid real dollars for his project to be completed, right? And if you are unreliable, that's not his problem necessarily. He's paid his dollars. So that's something that I think will become important. And as soon as we start getting these benchmarks, and that's something that was alluded to as well, is the benchmark tool hopefully would be out before the mining disrupt in the end. I think that it's the end of July, so hopefully we'll get something in terms of benchmark so we can sort of see where our GPU sort of stack up. But uptime is going to become a important thing here, and it's also important to have a look at overclock. So I know as a miner I do the same thing. I love overclocking my GPUs. At least in my head, I'm probably going to run my GPUs at stock at least at the start for proof of useful work. Now, scrolling down and having a look actually at the benchmark here, and this is now where it's actually quite cool. I really liked seeing this dashboard here. Here you can see the actual score, the average and the base score here. I would imagine, I'm not sure, this is sort of where the setup, where it ranks your setup or benchmarks that you've done before. Again, that's something that I'm going to look forward for. The other thing that I noticed here, if you have a look here at the bottom left, there's a light and dark mode. So I'm quite interested to see what the dark mode looks like. I'm a big fan of dark mode. I'm not liking this white too much, but as you can see here, this person is benchmarking a beast of a system here. You can see here for a 6000 GPUs on a Xeon, and they've got so much memory here. As you can see, 12 times 64 gigabyte sticks. So it's a lot of RAM. And again, that's sort of where I alluded to in the hardware recommendations, right? So what the team recommend is 4 times your system memory needs to be 4 times your total GPU memory. So that's a lot of RAM. And you can see sort of this system has got that. Also NVMe, this MP400, I think this is a Gen 4 NVMe, so this is quite a fast one. On the right hand side, you can actually see the usage. So CPU usage, also the CPU memory usage. Here you can see the 12 gigabytes, 12 sticks of 64 gigs. And here you can see your GPU usage as well. This is GPU number 4, so I'm not sure if you can toggle the different GPUs here, but here you can also see the memory. So 4 times 12 gigabyte of VRAM. So I'm not sure where this comes from, because I'm pretty sure the A6000 has got more than 12 gigs of RAM, to my knowledge. So I'm not sure exactly where these screenshots doesn't necessarily align. I'm not sure if that is a Photoshop thing or what happened there, or they may be slicing the GPUs up in smaller pieces of VRAM. Could potentially be that. The other thing here that I noticed is the actual network stats. Now, you would see here there is a big download and upload speeds here. Now, what you will do when you do proof of useful work, you'll be downloading work and uploading work, right? So your network speed will be a big factor in some of these things. So if you just take machine learning or AI or rendering, you will tend to have, or you will need to have, well, the faster your internet, the easier some of these tasks is going to be. But if we're specifically talking about cloud gaming, latency is key here. So the closer that you are to the server, the quicker that will be. So it's important that you would have a decent internet connection. One of the questions that was asked was around, what happens if you've got a bad upload speed, and that's typical here in Australia as well. At least the answer that was given is, you might not be suitable for all the tasks necessarily in proof of useful work, and that's just one of those things, right? But what I can see and what I'm deducting from proof of useful work and these things in general, if you look at normal GPU mining, you can take normal consumer grade hardware and you can actually mine and get rewards. When we're talking about proof of useful work here, this is now starting to become more of a data center and enterprise. So you're talking about motherboards that's got lots of PCIe lanes. You're talking about motherboards that supports a ton of RAM. You're talking about professional GPUs, massive upload and download speed. So you're actually starting to be a real data center and making use of a GPU. So that's just a different ball game to what GPU miners has been used to. So it's just something that you need to take into the back of your mind when you're looking at proof of useful work. It's not the same as GPU mining at all. Now, scrolling a little bit further down, here you can see more results in terms of the benchmark, and on the right hand side you can actually see the breakdown. So you can see the two cores, what the base and the max speed was, how many threads, the GPU stats, and specifically the hard drive stats here at the bottom. So it just gives you more information regarding the hardware. Now, again, this looks super cool, so neat. I really going to enjoy the benchmark, and a lot of people probably are going to benchmark their systems to see where they are lying. I must admit, I can't wait to benchmark my gaming GPU to see how that stacks up with some of this server grade hardware. But again, that's really where the benchmark is going to come in. We'll see where our systems lie, and throughout the community, everybody's hardware configuration is probably going to be completely different. And that is again a sidestep to what people have been used to in the mining community. People tend to use the same motherboards, the same CPUs, so their overall system generally looks the same. I think it will take a little bit of time before people figure out what is the most optimal proof of useful work setup. And again, that's what we're going to do the next couple of months and what I'm super excited for. Now, we've come to the end of the actual slides. Now, what do I deduce and what am I going to do based on this information that was shared? Now, I'm sure there will be lots of AMAs in the future, and I can't wait to cover those and look at the information that will be shared. And the next big thing is probably the benchmark. And again, as I mentioned, I can't wait to benchmark some of my systems to see where I'm at. But looking at the information that has been shared, it's pretty clear to me the writing is on the wall. Our typical GPU mining rig probably won't be the best rig specifically for proof of useful work. Just looking at the recommendations and the system requirements here, we're just going to need a lot of lanes. It needs to be PCIe Gen 3 lanes. We need 4 threads per GPU. We need a ton of RAM. So I will need to upgrade at least some of my GPU mining rigs. Now, again, what the sweet spot is going to be, I just don't know. I'm hoping that over the next couple of months, us as a GPU mining community would figure out what is the sweet spot. But at least what I'm going to do going forward is I would like to convert at least one of my rigs to a proof of useful work. Let's call it test bench or rig. So that is the rig and the money that I'm going to spend to at least convert one of them. Now, looking at that from a GPU perspective, so if I just take that down to a GPU just for a second, I'm not really interested in any AMD GPUs specifically for proof of useful work. Why? I'm a big fan of AMD GPUs. You've seen me, if you're following me on Twitter and you've looked at some of my videos, I do have quite a lot of AMD GPUs. I've actually got a 50-50 split in my farm. Half of the farm is AMD, half of it is NVIDIA. But for proof of useful work, in the professional market, NVIDIA is just the king. So the software and what everybody uses is geared to CUDA and geared to NVIDIA GPUs. Hopefully that changes in the future, but at least for me, the writing is the GPUs that I'm going to be using specifically for proof of useful work is going to be NVIDIA GPUs. That's unfortunately just how that cookie crumbles. Now, that is the GPUs. In terms of a platform, and what I mean by a platform is specifically the CPU, the motherboard, and the RAM. Now, what I'm thinking of, at least what I'm looking at, is the AMD Threadripper platform. So I'm hoping, and I've been checking on the second-hand market, that I can get some sort of first, ideally second-gen Threadripper system. The Threadripper system would at least give me, I've even seen some of them that can fit 7 GPUs, but at least would give me 4 GPUs with the lane requirements. It would give me lots of cores and fast cores for that matter. It will also give me way more RAM than what I actually need. So I'm really looking for these Threadripper platforms. Again, first or second gen platforms, I think should be at least a good fit. The other option is obviously Xeon server grade, so Intel server grade and AMD EPYC. But I'm not a big fundi, or I haven't played with real server grade hardware, so I'm not exactly sure what to buy, and I'm scared I make a mistake. Where Threadripper really is a high end or HEDT or whatever they used to call that segment, but it's more consumer grade. It's just better consumer grade, right? So I'm thinking of Threadripper and seeing what I can pick up secondhand. So that's sort of what I'm targeting. So what I'm thinking of doing is taking one of my open benches and taking my normal Z170 motherboard out and sticking the Threadripper on there. So that's really what I'm thinking in terms of GPUs and a platform setup is the Threadrippers. Now, what is my concerns, or at least the concerns that I have? And the first one being, and I really only have two, and again, I'm a big fan, I'm excited for proof of useful work, but I do think from a consumer perspective, so not necessarily from a miner perspective. And again, I have my miner hat on and looking at most of these things most of the time with my miner hat on, but at the end of the day, there is going to be a paying customer on the other side. So the platform and what that looks like in order to submit your work and pay for your work and get your work, I'm really hoping that that platform is as sleek and as user-friendly as can be. And again, some of the things that the Flux team has launched from an end user perspective in the past at least hasn't been the most user-friendly things. And again, launching an app is a good example of that. You sort of need to have a Zelcore wallet and you need to pay in Flux. So there's all these different things that make it a little bit harder for end users or the normal user to come in and actually participate. So I'm really hoping that the marketplace on the other side of these benchmarks is super easy and user friendly, and in such a way that customers can relate to email and password login, money back guarantees, the ability to pay in dollars, the ability to get an invoice. So these are the things that I'm looking for, at least my concerns. I haven't seen invoices, super user-friendly platforms on the other side of the Flux ecosystem. So again, that's just one of the concerns. But hopefully these things are getting addressed. And again, the Flux team are addressing, or at least on their roadmap is making most of the things a lot more user-friendly. So again, just a concern, I'm sure it will be addressed. Now, the last concern that I have just relates to security. There might be sensitive information that would be uploaded by the customer and then potentially in the hands of the actual proof of useful work miner. So the security not only of the data but also the platform, I think, is super key and important for the team to address. They might have already addressed it, but I'd like to see independent audits, audit results being published, those type of information to make sure that data is encrypted and it is secure. It will only also be important for a customer and from a getting big organizations to actually use the platform. So I really like to see more information become available around the security and audit of the platform. And again, similar information hopefully spills over to some of the node infrastructure where security updates becomes mandatory for nodes. But again, that's a different subject, but I'd love to see the security aspects to proof of useful work addressed and at least documented and shared what the other team are doing and potentially what are the things that they've put in place to make sure that the platform is ultimately secure.
That's it for this video, guys. If you've liked the video, please like the video and maybe even consider subscribing to the channel. If you didn't, please specify in the comments what you would like me to change. Otherwise, I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.